December 8, 1941. Tokyo. Cold air seeped through the wooden frames of the cabinet room as a thin layer of cigarette smoke drifted above the long table. A radio operator hurried in, breath sharp, hands trembling from the chill of the corridor. He carried a single sheet of freshly translated text. Roosevelt's address to Congress. Hideki Tojo looked up. His glasses caught the weak light of a lone ceiling lamp. The room was silent, except for the muffled rumble of distant sirens and the faint hum of telephones ringing somewhere beyond the sliding doors. Ministers shifted in their seats. Some avoided eye contact. Others clenched their coats tighter against the cold. No one spoke. The operator placed the paper before Tojo. The Prime Minister read slowly, line by line, the words striking harder than the winter air. The United States had moved with stunning speed. Congress was already united. War was declared. Tojo exhaled once, barely audible. A rare hesitation softened his posture. A moment of human weight pressing through the uniform. He lowered the page, and in a quiet voice, he said the words his ministers had feared. Because what happened next would rewrite everything. The cabinet room had fallen still, but the world behind that silence had been tightening for years. Japan entered 1941, cornered by mathematics it could not escape. Oil reserves were shrinking towards zero. Industrial output depended on resources the empire did not possess. And every month the embargo tightened, squeezing the nation with the slow precision of a vice. Inside Tokyo's political core, fear and ambition collided. The Army General Staff pressed for expansion, insisting that without Southeast Asia's oil fields, the empire would suffocate. Diplomats warned that war with the United States would ignite forces Japan could not match. Their cables to Washington grew more anxious as negotiations faltered. Schedules, deadlines, coded messages. Each carried the weight of a clock running out. By autumn, the debates sharpened into a narrow corridor of choices. Concession meant retreat. Retreat meant collapse. Military leaders argued that Japan's only chance was to strike before American industry fully awakened. Admirals presented estimates, tonnage calculations, shipbuilding timelines. Every chart said the same thing. Time favored the United States. The cabinet wrestled with this reality behind closed doors. Some whispered doubts, others pushed harder. Meetings stretched late into the night, rooms heavy with tobacco and exhaustion. Diplomacy continued on paper, but confidence in it had thinned. The country moved step by step toward the point where hesitation no longer seemed possible. By early December, the final decision had been sealed. And when the attack on Pearl Harbor began, many in Tokyo believed they had bought themselves months, perhaps even years, before America could respond. They were wrong. Across the Pacific, the shock of the attack struck Washington with a force Japan had not fully anticipated. The smoke was still rising over Pearl Harbor when Roosevelt stepped into action. His advisors brought him fragmented reports, burning ships, casualties mounting, communication lines scrambled. But the pattern was unmistakable. The nation had been struck without warning. And the political hesitation that Japan had counted on evaporated within hours. For months, American intelligence had tracked Japanese diplomatic codes, oil negotiations, and fleet movements. But the exact point of impact remained obscured. Now the uncertainty was gone. Roosevelt understood that clarity itself was a weapon. He dictated the first lines of his address with a level, controlled voice, framing the attack as a turning point in history. The phrase he chose, a date which will live in infamy. hardened the mood across the country. Congress reacted with rare unity. Representatives who had argued bitterly over intervention shifted as one. Isolationists, long resistant to foreign war, sat silent as the scale of the assault unfolded. Military officials reported the losses with precision. Battleships engulfed in flames. Airfields shattered, crews fighting for their lives. The urgency crystallized into an unmistakable message. The United States would not wait. It would move immediately. Roosevelt's request for a declaration of war reached Congress before many in Tokyo believed the president could even address the public. The vote was nearly unanimous. American mobilization began within minutes. Factories received instructions to accelerate production. Navy yards extended their shifts. Recruitment centers opened to crowds that formed before dawn. From Tokyo, this speed seemed impossible. Japanese planners had assumed American bureaucracy would delay any unified response. They expected negotiations, debates, procedural steps, a slow, uncertain path to war. Instead, by the time Tojo received the translation of Roosevelt's words, America was already in motion. Inside the Japanese cabinet, the emotional landscape was sharper than the official records reveal. Ministers carried the weight of a nation that had been living under rationed light, dwindling fuel, and a tightening sense of inevitability. Many had families with sons already serving in China or stationed across the Pacific Islands. The decision for war was not an abstract calculation to them. It was a step into a darkness they hoped would be brief, controlled and victorious before Japan's reserves ran dry. The Imperial Navy had warned repeatedly that it could win for 6 months, perhaps a little longer. But beyond that, the industrial scale of the United States would become overwhelming. Shipyards were already stretched. Aviation fuel was rationed. Engineers were modifying older vessels simply to keep them operational. Each plan relied on timing, precision, and the hope that the first strike would cripple the American fleet long enough to force negotiations. In the Army General Staff, the mood differed. Officers believed the empire's destiny required expansion, arguing that hesitation would lead to collapse. Maps covered entire walls. Southeast Asia's oil fields, shipping routes, choke points, distances measured in days of fuel. Logistics ruled every conversation. Without new resources, the war in China would grind to a halt. Industries would fail. Tanks and aircraft would stand still. Many officers viewed conflict with the United States not as a choice, but as the final card Japan had left to play. At the operational level, commanders studied their constraints with sober clarity. They understood the limits of Japan's steel production, the vulnerability of supply convoys, and the staggering distance of the Pacific theater. Pilots trained relentlessly, aware that replacements would be scarce. Sailors drilled in narrow harbors where every maneuver echoed the risks to come. Yet beneath this technical discipline lay a shared tension, a quiet recognition that the enemy they were preparing to fight possessed a capacity Japan could not match. They hoped speed would compensate. They hoped surprise would buy time. They hoped America would hesitate. But hope was not strategy, and the first cracks appeared the moment news of the U.S. declaration reached Tokyo. In Washington, the shock carried its own weight, but it did not paralyze. Inside the White House, Roosevelt's advisors moved through corridors crowded with officers, analysts, and messengers carrying updates from Hawaii. The initial confusion hardened quickly into structure. Intelligence teams sifted through intercepted cables. Naval planners calculated which ships could still sail. The Army assessed mobilization timelines measured not in months, but days. Roosevelt's leadership set the tone. He framed the attack not simply as an act of war, but as a unifying event, something that erased political fractures that had defined American debate for years. Cabinet members watched as public opinion shifted almost instantly. Newspapers printed extra editions. Lines formed outside enlistment offices. The country, which had resisted foreign conflict through years of argument, now presented a rare front of unanimity. For American commanders, the immediate concern centered on two questions: what Japan would strike next, and how fast the United States could restore its Pacific strength. Officers studied maps of the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and Midway. They knew the Japanese Navy had momentum. They knew American forces were exposed across a vast ocean. But they also understood a deeper truth. Once American industry mobilized, Japan's window of advantage would close. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, Japanese diplomats in Washington realized the speed of America's response before their own government did. The failure to deliver the final message on time, the note meant to signal the end of negotiations before the attack, had already damaged Japan's position. Ambassadors watched crowds gather outside the embassy, listened to radio broadcasts calling the attack treacherous, and understood that U.S. unity would be total. Military attachés reported that American factories were already shifting schedules, that naval yards were preparing emergency repairs, that Congress had moved with a decisiveness unseen in decades. These cables reached Tokyo as Tojo and his ministers processed Roosevelt's words. The contrast was stark. Japan had expected hesitation. What they faced instead was acceleration. That realization began to spread through the Japanese leadership, carrying with it the first hints of a future they had not planned for. Tojo remained seated as the murmurs around him faded. The declaration had arrived faster than any prediction offered by the intelligence bureaus. American political unity, expected to take weeks, had formed in hours. The document before him was more than a statement. It was a signal that the assumptions anchoring Japan's strategy were already eroding. Outside the cabinet room, Tokyo was alive with conflicting currents. Military couriers rushed through hallways carrying new directives. Telegraph operators tapped out encrypted messages to fleet commanders scattered across the Pacific. Army officers whispered about the next blows Japan needed to strike before American forces could reorganize. Every minute mattered, and the urgency pulsed through the buildings like an electric charge. Admiral Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, arrived with fresh reports. Pearl Harbor's success was confirmed, but so were unexpected details. American shipyards were already preparing emergency refits. Surviving vessels were being moved. Patrols were increasing. It was clear the attack had not delivered the crippling paralysis Japan had hoped for. Tokyo's brief window of advantage was shrinking. Inside the planning rooms, maps lay covered in markers indicating potential American responses. The Philippines, Midway, Wake Island, all vulnerable. And yet the tone had shifted. Officers read Roosevelt's speech and understood the psychological blow had not landed as expected. Instead of breaking American resolve, it had galvanized it. Tojo processed this quietly. He understood the weight of American industry, the scale of its manpower, the speed with which it could turn factories into arsenals. The cabinet had gambled that surprise would buy strategic breathing room. Now, confronted with the swiftness of the U.S. declaration, a different reality emerged. The war Japan had hoped to control was already accelerating beyond its grasp. Even before the next meeting convened, a deeper question settled into the minds of Japan's leadership. If this was America's response on the first day, what would follow when its full strength awakened? Messages continued to flood in. Reports of damaged ships, scattered survivors, and ash rising from burning hangars painted a chaotic picture. Yet amid the destruction, analysts noted patterns. The United States was already compensating, reallocating ships, rerouting supply lines, mobilizing reserves. Every calculation Japan had made to delay retaliation now seemed obsolete. The Imperial Navy scrambled to reinforce positions across the Pacific. Orders were transmitted in code, repeated over and over to avoid misinterpretation. Pilots prepared for long-range missions. Supply convoys were rerouted. Every movement carried urgency. But it was a race against a clock no one fully controlled. Distance, fuel, weather. The Pacific itself had become a strategic adversary, unforgiving and absolute. Tojo convened another session with his generals. The words spoken were careful, measured, yet the tension was palpable. The Prime Minister's earlier pause, now remembered by every minister in the room, was no longer just hesitation. It was recognition. Recognition that Japan's initial strike had triggered forces beyond prediction. That the empire had entered a contest defined not only by courage and skill, but by industrial might, resilience, and time. And that America had already seized both advantage and momentum. Even as strategies were revised, there was a shared awareness. The war they imagined as short and decisive might already be slipping from their control. The first day of response had revealed the contours of an enemy ready to endure, to rebuild, and to strike back faster than Tokyo could anticipate. The room emptied quietly. Officers returned to their posts. Messages continued to flow. And in the silence that followed, Tojo's reflection lingered, unspoken. Japan had ignited a war whose end was not theirs to command. The first days after the declaration were a blur of movement and calculation. Japanese officers tracked every radio signal, every movement of American carriers, every report from the Philippines and the Aleutians. Smoke from Pearl Harbor still rose, but already the United States had begun rebuilding, dispatching ships from the West Coast, redirecting aircraft, and mobilizing industrial reserves that Japan had underestimated. Tokyo streets carried a quieter tension. Civilians went about daily routines, unaware of the full scale of the unfolding crisis. Yet ministers and generals moved like shadows, revising plans, issuing orders, and calculating losses. Each report from the front lines added weight to an already tense atmosphere. Sailors and soldiers, exhausted and uncertain, felt the early burden of a conflict stretching farther and faster than any map had suggested. The psychological strain on leadership was acute. The speed of America's response created a cognitive dissonance. Japan had struck decisively, yet within hours the United States had turned the attack into a rallying point. Confidence wavered among those who had argued for bold aggression. Doubts that had been whispered behind closed doors now had evidence to support them. The war would not be short, the enemy not paralyzed. Strategically, Japan gained temporary advantage from surprise. Battleships damaged at Pearl Harbor could not counter immediately. American aircraft were scattered. But logistics, fuel, and repair crews were already mobilizing. Japan's early victories, though dramatic, had triggered a chain reaction that ensured the United States would respond with unprecedented speed and scale. The cost of that miscalculation would ripple through every theater of war to come. Weeks passed, and the initial shock of the attack began to crystallize into consequences that would define the war. American shipyards churned, workers running double shifts to replace and augment losses. Convoys were rerouted, airfields reinforced, and new carrier groups prepared for deployment. Every day Japan had hoped to use as leverage slipped away, consumed by the relentless machinery of American mobilization. Inside Tokyo, the human cost became tangible. Families of officers and sailors monitored casualty lists, each name a reminder that the empire had gambled more than strategy. It had gambled lives. Ministers who had advocated for decisive action now moved with urgency, tinged by anxiety. Reports of losses in secondary theaters, the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, arrived steadily, adding pressure to decisions already made in haste. Morale was a fragile commodity. Soldiers on distant islands were disciplined but tense, aware that reinforcements might arrive too late. Communications lagged. Supplies were limited. Each commander calculated risks, knowing that a single misstep could cost hundreds of lives. For civilians in occupied territories, the speed of conquest brought both fear and disorientation. The empire's image of controlled expansion clashed with the reality of logistics stretched to breaking. Strategically, Japan's early successes provided temporary breathing space, but revealed deeper vulnerabilities. Industrial capacity, fuel reserves, and manpower could not match the scale of America's response. Early victories became a double-edged sword. While symbolically powerful, they provoked a mobilization that Japan could not contain. In every branch of the military, from naval officers to army engineers, the realization dawned that the conflict now entering its second week would be measured not in months, but in years. The empire had struck first, but by the end of the first month, the response was already shaping a war beyond what Tokyo had planned. A war whose consequences would extend to every corner of the Pacific and the heart of the Japanese homeland. Years later, historians would look back at that moment in the cabinet room and see more than a single declaration. They would see the collision of calculation and misjudgment, of ambition and unanticipated speed. Tojo's pause, so human and fleeting, was a mirror of an empire caught between desire and reality. The United States moved with a velocity Japan could not match, its unity forged in the fire of attack. A single night's decisions, a single speech, had ripples that stretched across oceans and decades. In that quiet room, behind cigarette smoke and flickering lamps, the future of the Pacific was sealed, not by victory or loss, but by the unforgiving pace of history itself. And in that speed, that irreversible momentum, lies the weight of choices, the reminder that in war, time can be the deadliest weapon of all.